May 17, 1942. Smolensk, occupied Soviet territory. A Wehrmacht quartermaster captain opens a manila folder stamped Truppenbetreuung, troop welfare. Inside, requisition forms for 40 beds, medical inspection schedules, weekly soap allocations, and a typed list of 32 women's names with birthplaces ranging from Minsk to Warsaw. Next to each name, a number, projected monthly capacity. The folder sits between fuel requisitions and ammunition inventories. Same filing system, same bureaucratic precision. The captain signs 3 copies, files 1, sends 2 up the chain. It didn't look like chaos. It looked like procedure, forms in triplicate, signatures, rubber stamps, a logistics problem solved with the same methodical efficiency the Wehrmacht applied to tank maintenance and artillery supply chains. The Reich had calculated how many women per 1,000 soldiers. They'd established inspection protocols. They'd created rank-specific access tiers and designed mobile units that could follow advancing armies. They'd turned sexual exploitation into a managed resource with paperwork, quotas, and command authorization. The women on that list haven't volunteered. Most had been rounded up during occupation sweeps, threatened with starvation or deportation of family members, or simply seized. Their bodies were now inventory. Their suffering was a line item. Then it got worse, because this wasn't a local improvisation. This was policy, designed at the highest levels, implemented across every front from France to the Urals. And the system only expanded as the war dragged on. The Third Reich created one of history's most extensively documented systems of military-controlled forced prostitution. Beginning in 1939 and accelerating through 1941, Wehrmacht leadership, in coordination with SS administrative offices, established what internal documents called frontline brothels, facilities that ranged from requisitioned buildings in occupied cities to mobile trailers trailing combat units. The stated justifications combined pseudo-medical concern, racial ideology, operational security, and discipline management. The reality was systematic sexual slavery powered by occupation, coercion, and state violence. Thousands of women, predominantly from occupied territories, but also including German civilians facing economic or legal pressure, were trapped in a bureaucratic machine that treated human beings as renewable logistics assets. The planning began before the first shots of the war. Wehrmacht leadership studied previous conflicts and determined that unregulated sexual contact in occupied zones created 3 problems: assaults against local populations that complicated governance, venereal disease that reduced combat readiness, and potential intelligence leaks through uncontrolled civilian contact. The solution they designed was total control. Initial recruitment in Germany itself relied on economic desperation and legal coercion. Women arrested for prostitution, already criminalized and marginalized, were offered a brutal choice: forced labor camps or work in military-supervised facilities. Others, facing poverty in a wartime economy that had eliminated traditional support systems, were recruited through intentionally vague promises of service jobs. Once inside the system, leaving became nearly impossible. Women who attempted to resign faced arrest, deportation to concentration camps, or abandonment in hostile occupied territory without papers. As German forces conquered Poland, France, the Low Countries, and pushed into the Soviet Union, the system's architecture became clear. Wehrmacht administrative offices issued formal guidelines dividing facilities by rank, enlisted barracks brothels, separate NCO facilities, officer establishments, and specialized Luftwaffe houses. Each tier had different appointment procedures, pricing structures that used military scrip, and access rules.
The segregation reinforced military hierarchy while ensuring the system operated at every level. Stationary brothels were established in major occupation centers. Wehrmacht officials requisitioned hotels, apartment buildings, or purpose-built structures. Local collaboration was sometimes purchased, sometimes coerced. In France, some existing establishments were simply taken over and placed under military supervision. In Eastern territories, the process was more violent. SS and Wehrmacht units conducted roundups, targeting women based on age, appearance, and perceived racial classification under Nazi ideology. Jewish women were explicitly excluded, not for their protection, but because Nazi racial laws prohibited sexual contact between Germans and Jews. Instead, these women faced deportation and death. The mobile units represented the system's most disturbing innovation. As front lines advanced rapidly, especially during the 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union, Wehrmacht logistics officers received complaints from field commanders that stationary facilities couldn't serve forward units. The solution? Trailers equipped with beds, minimal medical supplies, and assigned women transported like any other military cargo. These mobile brothels, pulled by trucks, followed panzer divisions and infantry advances. Documentation shows mobile units attached to specific divisions, with personnel rosters maintained alongside vehicle inventories. Medical control provided the veneer of legitimacy. Every facility operated under mandatory examination schedules. Army doctors conducted weekly inspections, treating detected infections and maintaining health records. Condoms were distributed through military supply channels, the same logistics network that moved bullets and bandages. The medical supervision wasn't care, it was quality control. The goal was keeping soldiers disease-free, not protecting the women forced into the system. The mathematical precision was chilling. Internal Wehrmacht planning documents calculated capacity ratios: 1 woman to 100 to 150 soldiers in rear areas, higher concentrations near the front where demand peaked. Monthly quotas were established based on facility type and location. A stationary urban brothel might list capacity targets of 300 to 500 soldiers per woman per month. Mobile units operated under tighter schedules, with women expected to be available during assigned hours with minimal rest. These weren't estimates, they were performance targets embedded in official reports.
The women trapped in this system lived under constant surveillance and control. Movement outside facilities was restricted or forbidden. Guards monitored exits. Identity papers were often confiscated, eliminating escape options in occupied territories where local populations faced execution for harboring fugitives. Food rations were controlled, creating dependency. Clothing was provided, uniforms in some locations, standardizing appearance and marking status. Privacy didn't exist. Living quarters were dormitory style, shared rooms under supervision. The appointment system turned exploitation into a military routine. Soldiers received Berechtigungsschein, authorization coupons, allowing a specific number of monthly visits. The coupons were distributed through company commanders, making access to the system part of regular military administration. Extra coupons could be issued as rewards for combat performance, turning sexual access into an incentive structure. Coupons could also be revoked as punishment for infractions, making the system a discipline tool. Soldiers presented coupons at facilities' entrances, where clerks recorded visits in ledgers tracking utilization rates. Inside facilities, time was regimented. Appointments lasted 15 to 30 minutes, depending on establishment type, with cleaning intervals between. Some documentation mentions bells or whistles signaling time limits. The industrial precision stripped away any pretense of humanity. Women were processed like manufacturing inputs, their trauma measured in throughput metrics.
Medical examinations were invasive and dehumanizing. Weekly inspections involved gynecological checks by military doctors who documented findings in health files. Any detected infection resulted in removal from availability until cleared, not for the woman's well-being, but to prevent disease spread to soldiers. Documented cases exist of women with chronic infections being transferred to concentration camps as no longer useful. Treatment focused on rapid return to service. Punishment for resistance was swift. Women who refused soldiers faced beatings, solitary confinement, reduced rations, or threats against family members still in occupied territories. Some facilities maintained cells for discipline. In eastern territories, where occupation was most brutal, punishment could mean deportation to labor camps or execution. The threat of violence saturated every interaction. The psychological control ran deeper than physical coercion. Many women were isolated from their native languages, placed in facilities where they couldn't communicate with other victims or local populations. Letters home were censored or forbidden. Family contact was used as leverage: comply or never see relatives again. Some women were told their families believed them dead. The isolation compounded trauma, eliminating support networks.
March 1945. Soviet forces advancing through Poland liberate a Wehrmacht rear area camp near Lodz. Inside a requisitioned factory complex, they find a functioning brothel facility. 24 women, mostly Polish and Ukrainian, living in locked barracks attached to a medical inspection station. Red Army officers discover the administrative office intact. Wehrmacht personnel had fled hours earlier without destroying files. The records are extensive. 3 years of inspection logs, appointment ledgers tracking thousands of soldier visits, supply requisitions for medical equipment, and personnel rosters listing women by registration number rather than name. Each woman's file contains medical documentation, a photograph, and a typed biographical sheet noting hometown, age, and date of recruitment. The Soviet investigating officer documents interviews with survivors. Several women describe being arrested during 1942 occupation roundups, accused of unspecified infractions and given impossible choices. One woman's testimony, later preserved in Soviet archives, describes transport from Minsk in a truck with 19 others, arrival at a processing center where German uniforms were issued, and assignment to facilities based on age and appearance ratings recorded on forms. Another describes attempts to resist that resulted in solitary confinement and threats against her younger sister still in Minsk. A third recounts the weekly medical examinations, the ledger system tracking appointments, and the knowledge that refusing meant deportation to camps where survival was unlikely. The liberation finds the women in poor health, chronic infections, malnutrition, psychological trauma. Several are pregnant. One has carved marks on her arm counting days. The Soviet officers photographed the administrative office, preserving evidence of the Wehrmacht's methodical record-keeping. The medical logs show inspection dates continuing until days before liberation. The system operated until the last possible moment. This single liberation represented thousands of similar moments across Europe as Allied forces overran German positions. Each discovered facility revealed the same pattern: bureaucratic documentation, medical supervision, regimented control, and human beings reduced to inventory. The system persisted for 6 years because it served multiple functions within Wehrmacht operations. Military leadership valued the control it provided over soldier behavior in occupied territories. Commanders could point to reduced assault complaints in areas with facilities, not because violence had decreased, but because it was now channeled through official structures. The medical supervision offered justification: we are preventing disease.
The security argument held weight. Controlled facilities meant less contact with unsupervised civilians who might be partisans or intelligence assets. Middle-ranking officers embraced the system as a management tool. The coupon structure provided leverage for discipline and incentives for performance. Company commanders controlled distribution, giving them another mechanism for rewarding loyalty and punishing infractions. The rigid hierarchy of facility types reinforced military status markers. Access to better establishments signified rank and privilege. Lower ranks participated because the system was normalized through institutional structures. Receiving coupons was routine, presented as standard military service provision like mail call or canteen access. Official medical supervision suggested legitimacy. The bureaucratic framework made exploitation seem like administrative procedure rather than atrocity. Soldiers could tell themselves they were following orders, utilizing official facilities, submitting to medical checks, all the markers of legitimacy the Wehrmacht intentionally constructed. Civilian collaboration, both within Germany and in occupied territories, stemmed from a mix of coercion, economic pressure, and ideological alignment. Building managers who leased properties to Wehrmacht offices faced punishment for refusal. Local police forces in occupied zones who assisted with roundups operated under threat themselves, collaborate or join the arrested. Some collaborators genuinely supported Nazi ideology and viewed participation as serving Reich interests. Others were trapped in impossible positions where refusal meant reprisal. The normalization ran through propaganda and euphemistic language. Official documents used terms like troop welfare, recreational facilities, and morale services. The bureaucratic machinery, requisition forms, medical protocols, inspection schedules created an illusion of legitimacy. When exploitation is processed through paperwork and approved by authorities, ordinary people find ways to rationalize participation. The Wehrmacht relied on this psychological distance, turning atrocity into administrative routine. Silence was enforced through multiple mechanisms. Women trapped in the system couldn't speak. They were isolated, threatened, and had no access to outside communication. Soldiers were discouraged from discussing facilities in correspondents' home, officially for operational security, but practically to maintain the system's invisibility. Local populations in occupied territories who witnessed roundups or facility operations remained silent out of fear. Resistance meant execution. The conspiracy of silence protected the system from accountability. As Allied armies closed in from east and west during late 1944 and early 1945, the Wehrmacht system began fragmenting. Retreating German forces evacuated some facilities, transporting women westward with other military assets. Other installations were simply abandoned, leaving women behind without papers, resources, or protection in combat zones. Documentation shows frantic orders about facility closures, but implementation was chaotic. Some women were loaded onto transport trains alongside military equipment. Others were released into destroyed cities where survival was uncertain. The deliberate destruction of records began as defeat loomed. Wehrmacht administrative offices received orders to burn sensitive files before evacuation. Many facilities' documentation was destroyed in final days, erasing evidence of operations. The records that survived did so by accident. Soviet forces overrunning positions too rapidly for complete destruction, or individual commanders failing to execute destruction orders. What remains represents a fraction of the system's full documentation. Some women were absorbed into general refugee flows, displaced persons whose specific victimization remained invisible among millions fleeing combat. Others found themselves trapped between advancing armies, in territories where German forces had withdrawn, but Allied control hadn't yet established. For women from occupied eastern territories, return home was complicated by Nazi deportation policies that had stripped them of papers, by family shame when victimization was discovered, and by Soviet suspicion of anyone who'd spent years in German custody. The naval operations, which the script claims frequently violated formal Wehrmacht guidelines due to extended deployments, produced particularly harsh conditions that survivors rarely documented. Port facilities operated under looser supervision, with longer appointment durations and fewer medical safeguards. As U-boat operations intensified and surface fleet movements became more desperate, naval personnel reportedly faced fewer restrictions on facility access. The evidence for naval violations comes primarily from post-war testimony rather than preserved documentation, making reconstruction difficult. Testimony suggests that as the Reich collapsed, some women were transferred to concentration camp systems, classified as no longer useful. Others were simply executed by SS units, conducting scorched earth withdrawals. A documented February 1945 incident in East Prussia describes an SS detachment executing 15 women from a Wehrmacht facility during evacuation, buried in a roadside mass grave discovered months later. The killings were framed as eliminating security risks, but reflected the expendability with which the regime viewed these women.
Post-war accountability for Wehrmacht's sexual slavery system was staggered and incomplete. The major Nuremberg tribunals focused primarily on concentration camp atrocities, military aggression, and systematic genocide. Forced prostitution received limited attention in the initial proceedings. When it appeared in testimony, it was often subsumed under broader categories of war crimes against civilians. Subsequent trials conducted by individual Allied powers occasionally addressed specific cases. Soviet prosecutors documented evidence from liberated facilities in Eastern Europe, incorporating findings into broader cases against Wehrmacht occupation policies. French authorities prosecuted some collaboration cases involving facility operation in occupied France. But systematic prosecution of the architects and implementers of the military brothel system never occurred. Many officers responsible for administering the program were never charged, their involvement buried in broader Wehrmacht service records. The women themselves faced immense barriers to justice and recognition. Shame and stigma silenced many survivors. Post-war societies, including Germany, were often hostile to women who'd been forced into prostitution, viewing them as willing collaborators rather than victims. Family rejection was common. Official recognition as victims of Nazi persecution came slowly and partially. Some survivors qualified for minimal compensation under later German restitution programs, but proving their status required documentation that had often been destroyed, and testimony that forced them to relive trauma. Historical documentation of the system emerged gradually. Soviet archives contained evidence from liberated territories, but remained classified during the Cold War. Western historians initially focused on other aspects of Wehrmacht operations. Survivor testimony was scattered and often unpublished. The first comprehensive historical studies didn't emerge until decades after the war, as archives opened and scholars began systematically reconstructing the system's scope. Modern estimates of the total number of women forced into Wehrmacht brothel systems range widely due to incomplete records. Conservative historical analyses suggest, at minimum, several tens of thousands of women passed through the system across all fronts between 1939 and 1945. Less conservative estimates, based on facility documentation and capacity calculations, run higher. The actual number will never be known with precision. Too many records were destroyed. Too many women died without identification. Too many survivors remained silent. The system's legacy extends beyond individual trauma. It represents how bureaucratic structures can normalize atrocity through procedure,
how exploitation becomes routine when processed through official channels, and how totalitarian regimes weaponize every aspect of human existence. The Wehrmacht didn't improvise this system. They planned it, documented it, managed it with the same administrative precision they applied to logistics and operations. That methodical approach is what makes it so historically disturbing.
May 17, 1942. A folder with 32 names. Each name attached to a monthly capacity target. Each target representing hundreds of acts of exploitation processed through appointment schedules and ledger entries. Multiply that single facility by hundreds across occupied Europe. Multiply those hundreds across 6 years of war. The mathematics become overwhelming, not the arithmetic of bullets and battles, but the accounting of systematic dehumanization. The Wehrmacht system of forced prostitution operated in at least hundreds of documented facilities, from France to the Soviet Union. Conservative estimates suggest tens of thousands of women were trapped in the system, with actual numbers likely higher. The bureaucratic documentation that survived shows appointment logs recording hundreds of thousands of soldier visits, medical files tracking thousands of examinations, and capacity reports measuring human suffering in monthly quotas. The women forced through this machine came from across occupied Europe: German citizens facing legal coercion, Polish and Soviet women seized in occupation roundups, French and Dutch women caught in economic desperation, and countless others whose names never entered any archive. Many didn't survive. Those who did carried trauma that post-war societies refused to acknowledge for decades. The captain in Smolensk signed his requisition forms and filed them properly. 3 copies, appropriate routing, everything documented. That folder sits somewhere now, if it survived. Aging paper in a warehouse or archive, evidence of a system that processed human beings like military supplies. The signature is still visible. The stamp is still legible. The names are still there, each attached to its calculated capacity number. That's what remains: paperwork, testimony, scattered evidence of a machine that turned bodies into logistics targets. The Reich calculated ratios, established protocols, maintained documentation, and implemented procedures. They organized rape with the same methodical efficiency they brought to conquest. The horror isn't that it happened. The horror is that it was planned.